Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 146 of the PetroNerds podcast. My name is Trisha Curtis. I am the CEO of PetroNerds and the host of the PetroNerds podcast. And boy, are we going to get PetroNerdy today. Today is Tuesday, December 2nd, 2025. It is in the evening. We're about 7 o'clock in the evening right now. We're looking at oil prices at $58.67 for WTI, $62.45 for Brent. And holy crap, we're almost knocking on the door of $5 an MCF for Henry Hub net gas prices. So we have a lot of ground to cover on all the moves that are driving that, including where U.S. oil production is, what's happening with geopolitics, what's happening with the rig count, the Putin meetings that we just had with Steve Witkoff and Kushner actually going to Russia. Putin is going to India. I mean, there's a whole lot happening. If you are following the stock market, I'm not accessing CNBC right now because they took it off of Fubo. But if you're following the stock market and you're looking at Bloomberg or listening to Bloomberg surveillance, it is like whiplash listening to whether the Fed is going to cut rates or not cut rates on a weekly basis. And also just hearing about Bitcoin and the state of the consumer, it is back and forth. You can find for every person that thinks we're going to have a rough year next year or we're not going to have a Santa Claus rally, you can find another that does. So incredible whiplash on the economic front, but a lot of ground to cover when it comes to what is actually driving oil prices and why are we sitting at $58.67. So we're going to get into all of that in the introduction. I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet. However, we are coming off of Thanksgiving, and so everybody's been on a holiday, and there's been a lot going on in the market. So we're going to have a lot of ground cover. This podcast is the keynote speech I gave at the Whitley Penn conference in Houston on October 29, 2025. So it's only a month old, and it's really, really timely because the questions that Amanda Beabout, who was on stage with me with Whitley Penn, asked me are very, very prudent. So we spend a lot of time talking about the state of oil prices, this negative pessimism and downside sell button stuff on oil prices, and what's really happening with China. This was right when Trump was going over to South Korea. He was giving talks in South Korea and he was meeting with China. So this was all taking place right as I was doing this talk. And then the Fed was also meeting as well. So a lot happening there. And now we have all these debates on, is the Fed going to cut rates next week and will it be a hawkish cut, et cetera. But I'm going to get into what I cover in all of this. It's a very thorough round the world tour. Really appreciate Whitley Penn doing this. This is four of these keynote talks. I recorded all of them. They've all been podcasts. The feedback on them has been really, really good. So the feedback from the audience was fantastic when I was there. But the feedback from the previous podcast that I did, the talks I did in Dallas and in Fort Worth and in Midland were really fantastic. So thank you guys so much for listening. All right. So enough of that. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone, but we are going to get into the weeds here. So we are looking at this economic whiplash. That's very real. But if you're having whiplash in terms of, questioning why are we exactly at $58.67 oil and why shouldn't we be higher? I'm still of the mind that we should be at $65 oil easily, given the amount of geopolitical risk and more geopolitical risk that we have in the market. And I say from Russia, we do have, so Steve Witkoff, special envoy to the U.S., was in Russia today meeting with Putin. We had, as well as Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law. And I'm going to give you a little backstory on this because it is interesting in terms of the run up to this. So last week, you were probably hearing, if you're watching the news at all over the holiday week, you were hearing that, Ukraine was not happy with the peace plan that basically the Russians had, that the U.S. had. That was changed, right? The peace plan was actually changed. Now Ukraine Zelensky is out on TV and he's been talking about that he is much happier with it. And then Putin sort of walked things back and Russia kind of walked things back, saying they weren't going to televise or debate or talk about the peace plan on TV, which really means they were kind of setting a lower bar for expectations. And it does seem like Putin and the entire Russian negotiating team, they're willing to have these meetings, they're willing to have these talks, but it's a lot like the Chinese where they're willing to have a meeting, but nothing's going to come of it. And so I think the big difference that you're hearing is that, there has to be guarantees on the peace deal. And so there was a lot of things changed in the peace plan that the U.S. brought to Putin that they didn't see before, right? These are a lot of new changes. And so I wouldn't say they threw cold water on it. I would say that it was a downplaying. You didn't hear, hey, we made a lot of great progress. They had a 5-hour long meeting. They said they did make good progress, but they did not come to an agreement. So that you just put a pin in that. And that is what we hear continually. I'm not saying we can't get a deal. I'm saying it is far off, and being able to trust Putin and trust the Russians to not break that deal, it's really hard. And so if you're putting in that deal that you're giving Ukraine guarantees or security guarantees, it's going to be harder for Russia to break it, and they're not going to be as willing to do it. So that's what's happening on that side. And then Putin has been outwardly talking about getting on TV and getting on talking to reporters and saying that if Europe wants a war, they will get one. Now, this is in the context that you are having a pretty serious escalation in, I've talked about this before, but the pretty serious escalation of the missile and drone attacks that Russia is bombarding Ukraine with. You saw significant over Thanksgiving and over the weekend, significant attacks on Kiev. So they're really trying to hit at the heart. They're really trying to get the morale. They're trying to get power generation. They're trying to hit at Ukraine when it's really cold and it's wintertime. They're trying to really hit at their ability to continue to fight this war. So they're hitting Kiev. They're going to continue to hit power infrastructure. And in response, you are seeing that Ukraine is they're hitting their oil infrastructure. So they're continually hitting oil refineries, which go offline and then get repaired. They're continuing to hit oil infrastructure and terminals. And they've now hit 3 Russian tankers. Now, I think all these Russian tankers were supposedly empty, but the fact that they hit them and lit them up and lit them on fire, that's a note to the market, right? So really interesting is I think that oil prices should be higher based on that alone. However, we have a lot of supply on the market, partly because the US data just came out for the end of the month of November, and we are now at 13.84 million barrels per day. So we know we're well supplied in the market. However, we have this incredible bias and downside sell button on oil. So I think we should easily be at 65 given just this alone for the geopolitical risk premium. But then you add in what's going on with China and Japan, and then you add in what's going on with just the increased tensions and anxiety and what we are doing, what the US is doing in Venezuela and in Latin America, that should give a higher geopolitical risk premium because essentially you do have Venezuelan crude, Iranian crude, and Russian crude all at risk. Now, it's going on the water and it is being moved, but the question is at what point does some of this crude materially get sanctioned and pulled off the market? That's tricky because right now it seems like China is willing to buy a lot of this crude. They actually have mandated in their fourth plenum in their meeting that was in October that they're going to continue to buy. And they're continuing to emphasize strategic petroleum reserves, so they're continuing to put more crude in the SPR. And at $58.67, why the hell wouldn't they? So they have an incentive to do this. They're also getting further discounts on Russian crude and further discounts on Iranian crude. Now we are also seeing despite India saying that they were not going to take Russian crude, Putin is actually going to India this week. So if you look at this Bloomberg article, quote, the headline is Putin's India visit tests New Delhi's U.S.-Russia balancing act. So this is going to be tricky for India. The fact that they're even saying, "Hey, come here and let's host you," that's not going to make the Trump administration very happy because they're trying to they're getting these tariffs lowered because they're not going to take this crude. And obviously Russia wants them to continue to take their crude oil. China is obviously continuing to take their crude oil, but we're talking about 2 million barrels a day to India, 2 million barrels a day to China. So a lot of crude at stake for Russia. So if you're looking at headlines, basically this has been a very fluid stuff going on in the last few days with Russia and Ukraine. We've had Ukrainian delegations actually in Florida meeting with Trump officials. I think Witkoff was actually there in Florida just yesterday, and then he went to Russia today to meet with Putin. So I gave you the backstory of kind of the Putin and team kind of downplaying this. The headline from Bloomberg says, quote, Kremlin calls Russia-U.S. talks constructive, but no deal reached. So the Kremlin essentially allowed for video footage and some photos taken and then said, hey, but we're not going to do a lot of live coverage on this. And I think that's their expectation, that they weren't going to get a deal reached. And then you had the US side saying, and the Ukrainian side saying, we're probably not going to have a meeting until we get to a point where we can have a meeting, right? That we're making some real progress. So there is no deal reached, but you had oil selling off on all of that. And then we have a lot of talk. You had a cabinet meeting today. You had Pete Hegseth talking about these attacks on vessels out of Venezuela. These carriers that they said were cargoes for drugs and the attacks and the killings on these. There's a lot of controversy on that. I'm not going to get into that right now. But my point here is that there's a lot of stuff going on in Latin America by the U.S. Going after drug cartels. I think a lot of this has to do a lot more with China than people realize, and pushing China out of our backyard. Latin America, it is messy, but there is a lot of crude oil at stake, and this is getting volatile. So that alone, just having confrontation and friction south of in South America should put a little bit of geopolitical risk premium on oil. And what you're hearing from market analysts and folks is that essentially it's putting a floor on oil. I'm not sure that the floor is warranted. Absolutely. I'm not sure that we should be having at least a few dollars more of that risk premium priced in. And I think it is really tricky right now. All the stuff we're hearing about Russia and Ukraine, as I've mentioned, the significant attacks that Russia is doing on Ukraine, especially in the winter, trying to attack their infrastructure, trying to attack everything that's going on, trying to really impact their morale. That is really significant. So, if Russia's trying to impact the Ukrainian morale, they're really ramping up their targeting of missile strikes and drone strikes. They're targeting Kiev. We saw that over Thanksgiving. They're really trying to get this to where the Ukrainians no longer want to fight. Now, you are seeing Zelensky. He was in Ireland. He's been meeting with Macron. You're seeing a lot of the stuff where both the U.S. and Europe are meeting with Zelensky, and they're trying to shore this up. Now, that being said, is that on the Russian side, Russia's not willing to yet back down, but there is pressure saying, are they going to be able to win this war? And there's questions of, what's the end of sight? There's no exactly end of sight to this war for Russia, yet they are continuing it. And we've heard from China that they're incentivized to continue this, right? They don't want Ukraine to win. And, honestly, they're not going to say, hey, we want this war to continue. We want Russia to keep fighting it. But it benefits them significantly because they're supporting the war efforts for Russia. They're getting a lot of stuff in return, including crude, including coal, and a lot of materials that they're getting at discounts. And basically, they have a captivated market because they're the only purchaser of a lot of this stuff from Russia. And lastly, on this point, we're continuing to see drones and air balloons from Russia enter European airspace. So the latest one is Lithuania, where we have air balloons that have actually shut down air travel. You're just not hearing enough of this, I think, on the market coverage that I'm seeing. We're not hearing enough of this talked about. Again, these are the reasons why I think oil prices are not priced quite high enough, and the fact that you're seeing almost daily and weekly incursions into European airspace by Russia. And obviously you're hearing Putin say, if Europe wants a war, they'll give it one. So there's a lot going on that front. I don't think I'm not saying we can't have a deal, but I think we're quite far from having a peace deal, a sustainable, lasting peace deal with Ukraine and Russia. To the fact that they can actually both agree on it, we're not there yet. Ukraine is willing; they keep talking about that. We're having the talks with Russia, but we are not there yet. Okay, so when I come back to Venezuela a little bit, I'm not going to get into all the stuff you're hearing in the news and being debated on what's going on with the ships and whether or not they're going after Hegseth, et cetera. That's all ongoing within the news. However, when I'm listening to Bloomberg surveillance, or when I'm listening to the Bloomberg political take, and they have the Republican analysts and the Democrat analysts, and they talk about this, it is very interesting to me that the guy on the Democratic side, is saying, hey, Maduro's a bad guy, take this guy out. So you have a lot of bipartisan support on the fact that what's going on within Venezuela, the fact that Maduro is not a good guy, and the fact that we do have a lot of drugs and a lot of issues from these countries. So that all being said, is that until that stops, this is Venezuela, any country in Latin America that is producing crude. I mentioned, I think, in previous podcasts that Brazil has a lot of crude that they are producing that is now getting on the water. That is not the oil on the water. It is weighing on oil on the water, but it's just taking time to get to market. And so all this volatility, any kind of friction or fraction, or the fact that we're actively involved on a military level in South America or Latin America, means that there's going to be movement issues for crude oil. And so that's going to impact the crude oil market. Now, that could impact the times in which crude oil has to get to market, and that could in theory weigh on prices because there's more oil on the water. However, in my opinion, this should be putting upside pressure to oil prices as well. So that being said, the next big thing I just want to mention, I talked about in the previous introduction in the previous podcast, is the ongoing confrontation between China and Japan. So I talk about China a lot in this keynote talk. You'll see with in this moderated keynote talk that you're going to listen to for this podcast. But right now, this friction between China and Japan. A few weeks ago, it was Japan's newly elected prime minister. She said, "quote that an incursion into Taiwan by China would be a survival threatening situation. And the point here is that, and I mentioned this before, is that really Japan, they do something that the US does or has done previously, whereas they just don't talk about it a lot, right? They have a strategic ambiguity. So everyone knows that the US is likely going to come to Taiwan's aid. And people like to talk about it now, saying that, Trump would not come to Taiwan's aid. That is not true. We've actually there's a lengthy interview by the Taiwanese foreign minister on Bloomberg last night, and they keep replaying a lot of it today and this evening. You can listen to that on Bloomberg, and he basically says that um, this issue between Japan and China is going to take some time to resolve, potentially a year to resolve, because it's very serious. But he also says that, hey, Trump is supportive of Taiwan. However, he is pushing Taiwan to be more supportive of themselves. And so, of course, he's going to say that, but that also means that it is not that this administration, especially Marco Rubio, the State Department, no one is backing away from Taiwan. They're just not explicitly saying it the way Biden himself did. And then the Biden administration walked it back whenever Biden would say, we are going to directly support Taiwan. Now, what Japan did is just talk about the situation. They didn't even say, we will directly support Taiwan. They said this will be a survival threatening situation, meaning that they would support Taiwan. And the response by China has been absolutely incredible. So last night, I've talked about this before, but Bloomberg is unbelievably biased toward China. They must literally have Bloomberg folks in their ear saying, don't get negative on China or let that guy speak, because Victor Gao, he's the head of the Center for China and Globalization. He's a member of the Communist Party. He's basically just a Communist Party mouthpiece. He was on Bloomberg last night giving a 10-minute long interview, just shredding Japan and saying that Japan was calling for war, and that they were threatening the peace between China and the US, and that they were calling for war, and that is literally what the Japanese prime minister, he said, that Victor Gao said, that Japan was calling for war, that we can't let them be a nuclear power. I mean, on and on and on. He actually said that when Japan surrendered in 1945, they actually surrendered to China and the Allies. So just an incredible, massive Chinese propaganda mouthpiece. If you want to know, how they're thinking and how they're talking, and the fact that we don't get really good coverage on China, that is a really, really perfect example. Now, that all being said, we are seeing material impacts to tourism, to travel, but on both sides, where Japanese are not going to China now, and we're not seeing China going to Japan. We're actually seeing travel or airlines being impacted, 40% reduction in December travel from China to Japan for the month of December. And we're hearing similar stories on both sides when it comes to hotels. So serious economic impact on the trade between, or the travel, and will be trade as well, between China and Japan. Okay, so all that is going on in oil. I think all that is, this is your big movers to drive oil prices higher. You could argue that the economic impact of some of this thing would drive it lower. Now, absolute economic whiplash if you were following the Fed and Fed rate cuts, or bets on the Fed rate cutting, whether it's going to be a hawkish cut next week or whether it's not going to be a cut. The Fed is meeting next week. They're going to have a December 9th and 10th meeting, and then the Fed's going to come out and decide whether they're cutting. We are hearing, obviously, the Trump administration is going to remove Powell from his post, and he's going to put in somebody else. So lots going on that front. But really, really importantly, just for folks to think about, is that the Fed last year, I mentioned this, they lowered interest rates by 100 basis points, right? They didn't impact the long end of the curve, or the 10-year yield specifically, which is correlated to the 30-year mortgage rate. And so what happens right now is the 30-year mortgage rate, we're looking at 6.3%. And so it has moved down, but not materially. And so if the Fed lowers interest rates, but the market doesn't feel like we're lowering inflation, or they think we're going to have lasting inflation, or they think that we're going to have, that the government is not going to, fall through on their debt repayments, then you start seeing treasury yields move up, and then you start seeing that long end of the curve get out of whack, and then you don't do anything to the mortgage side. So that's not exactly what happened. It's not exactly what happened a year ago, but it's somewhat, right? Is that when the Fed lowered interest rates, they did it prematurely of 100 basis points last year. They said this was based upon concerns about the labor market. Now we might have some real concerns about the labor market, and that's why you have a lot of folks saying we should start lowering interest rates. We haven't seen that yet materialize, and so there's concerns. People are more concerned about their jobs. They're unable to get new jobs quickly, and so we have a lot of question marks in that space. But we do not have a full out and out unemployment rising massively situation, and so we have a lot of trickiness in that situation. But the point I'm making is that if the Fed lowers interest rates and we don't have rising unemployment, and we still have economic growth, and we have sticky inflation, it's not going to necessarily be a super bad thing, but it means that you could lose or get the handle on inflation. That's a problem. And then I'm not concerned at all about the devaluation of the dollar. I'm not concerned about people pulling out of the dollar. You heard the debasement moves. You heard a lot of these trades and a lot of this talk earlier this year, and you've now had movement back into the dollar. If we have a global recession or global calamity, all money comes back into the dollar because we are the most stable and liquid treasury market in the entire world. But the point I'm making is that if we have real concerns about inflation or lasting inflation, and whether it's government spending or not government spending, that does impact, treasury yields and impacts the long end of the curve. So the problem is the Fed did not stick with inflation. They didn't raise interest rates high enough. And so now they're trying to lower interest rates, and they're in this sticky position where they really don't know what to do. And the problem is, if they would just say what they're going to do and do it, the market would adapt to it. But the market hasn't been able to adapt because they are doing Fed meeting by meeting and don't know what they're really doing. So I don't have a lot of confidence in the clarity and trajectory of the Fed, whether they remove Powell or not. I don't think that clarity is going to get much better. Okay, so whiplash with the Fed. Now, when it comes to U.S. oil production and when it comes to that gas, so I mentioned WTI is at 58.67. We're looking at Brent at 62.45. In the previous podcast, I talked to you guys about, I don't think the Saudis are they really understand U.S. shale. I think they are off now by U.S. shale. U.S. oil production, they probably thought we were peaking at 13.2 million barrels per day. We are now at 13.84 million barrels a day as the data from the end of November from the EIA. That's September production data. That means we could clip 14 million barrels a day by the end of this year. That's extremely impressive. That's more than we've ever produced. We break records each month. We go up. So we're looking at, Saudi Arabia producing 10, Russia producing around 10. We're producing nearly 4 million barrels a day more than them. Significantly, I mean, the geopolitical ramifications for this are really, really important. So 13.84 million barrels per day. We saw an uptick actually of 14,000 barrels a day out of Oklahoma, New Mexico. I love this story because New Mexico literally looks like a rocket ship for production. We're looking at 2.35 million barrels per day out of two counties in Mexico, Lee and Eddy County. I can't tell you, in the last several years, I've heard so many people tell me that New Mexico has peaked. They obviously haven't. That is with a pretty strong and stringent, strict regulatory environment, and with prices at what we're seeing right in these 60s handles. Imagine if we had $70 barrel oil, what it would look like for New Mexico. Texas was down a smidgen. Alaska was actually up from 387,000 barrels a day to 418,000 barrels a day. So we didn't have massive moves anywhere, but we have this incremental grind higher on production. That's part of the story. But really, really importantly, it is a kind of a holy crap moment I'm seeing and thinking about is Henry Hub is at Henry Hub is at $4.84. We are seeing Dutch TTF, dollars per MMBTU on a dollar basis, at 9.57. So what is happening, and I talked about this in the previous podcast, is that we're seeing a significant rise in LNG exports. And I just double checked this. We're not seeing a massive move in natural gas. We're not seeing a massive move in natural gas going to the grid. That's happening on an incremental basis. But the problem is we continue to add this wind and solar. We're not aggressively adding that gas. We are decommissioning coal. This is really coming from these LNG exports and is driving these prices up. So we actually had the latest data from the EIA is showing that between November 13th and November 19th, we were exporting about 18.5 BCF a day. I was talking to Toby Rice. We're exporting actually right now around 20 BCF a day right now. So you're looking at going from 15 BCF a day to 20 BCF a day. That is what is driving this move up from $3 an MCF earlier this year to almost $5 an MCF right now. Now we're looking at production really holding kind of flat month over month for gross withdrawals, just over 131 billion cubic feet per day for natural gas. I think this will go up given that we're seeing the rig count for natural gas has risen 30 rigs year over year. 30 rigs year over year. So we started the year out at 100 rigs. We're now at 130. We're looking at the total rig count at 544 rigs, really seeing some nice plateauing on the rig count. So if you are calling for production to decline in the U.S., we're going to have to have some material declines on the rig count and some material declines on completions and complete a lateral feet to change this. I don't think lateral lengths are getting shorter, and I don't think we're going to go materially cut wells. We're going to see a lot of treading water with companies drilling and completing wells. They're not going to be making a ton of money. They're not going to be drilling massively and completing massively, but they're not going to stop either. So I don't see production declining off a cliff unless we saw a move down to 50, 55 and sustain there. But the point I'm making here on nat gas is that nat gas can be a driver and will be a driver. If we sustain this $5 or getting to a $5 handle, we're definitely going to see some plays across the U.S. where we're going to push the incentive to go for the gassier areas of these oil-rich plays, specifically in the Delaware, specifically in the Permian. So you need to watch that space closely because that can help be a driver, can help offset some of this downside pessimism on oil. So 130 nat gas rigs, smaller molecule, easy to frack. I think we are definitely going to see natural gas production increase, or we should see it increase. But we are also seeing right now, important to point out, is that typically there is a direct correlation when you see increasing storage volumes, and if you're maintaining your output, you're increasing storage volumes, you don't have as severe winter as projected, or don't have significant drawdowns in nat gas, you see nat gas prices go down. And right now, we are actually seeing storage volumes on the top end of that 5-year average, and we're not seeing prices go down. And that is because this 5 BCF a day increased exports. Really important. I think you need to watch that space closely. I have been talking about this a lot. I think it's super important. I have this op-ed. I'm going to put a link in the show notes. This is rising electricity prices started well before AI. The point I'm making here is that I love that we have a rise in natural gas prices. I think that's really good. I am super supportive of more nat gas being in the grid. I'm very supportive of more LNG exports, but I do not want the oil and gas industry getting blamed for rising electricity prices. That happened well before artificial intelligence, happened well before natural gas, these increase in LNG exports. And we have more than enough natural gas to solve this problem. We can, and we will be drill baby drilling for natural gas at $4.84 an MCF. So watch that space because I think production is going to grow. But we have a lot of natural gas. We are not utilizing it. And we are in a direct head-to-head competition with China when it comes to AI, when it comes to everything. And this comes down to energy. And China, I just heard somebody on Bloomberg last night say China has the cheapest energy because of wind and solar. No, they do not. China is the cheapest energy because they have coal, because they have 5,800 terawatt hours of coal-fired power generation, and that is why their energy is cheap. The reason they have wind and solar is because wind and solar is a domestic source of energy, like coal. And so they want more energy security. And when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, doesn't matter how much it costs, it means that they're not burning that coal and they can stockpile that coal just like they're stockpiling crude oil. So super, super important to think about that in the context of competition and direct head-to-head competition. Okay, folks. So before I give you the roundup on this quick overview on what we're going to talk about within this keynote talk and presentation, I just want to give a shout out to everyone who's been listening to the podcast. Thank you so much. The reviews really this year have been off the charts. I get so many text messages, so many emails. I get a lot of LinkedIn posts of people saying, "Hey, have you listened to the latest PetroNerds podcast? It's awesome." I really, really appreciate. Please, like it on Apple, on iTunes, on Spotify, wherever you're listening. So thank you so much to the listeners. And if you can just see the amount of work that I put into doing an introduction, you can imagine the amount of work that I do for clients. So if you are on the fence about working with PetroNerds, it is time. 2026 is a great time to get off the fence and call PetroNerds. Reach out to me directly on the website, on the info, on the contact us page. I'll put the link in the show notes. Really appreciate you guys listening. Would love to work with you guys. Happy to come in and give a one-off talk to your company and talk about the state of the market and really get into these weeds and talk to your executives and CEOs and C-suite and folks on the ground. I'm really hoping to have more boots on the ground time next year. I want to spend time in Wyoming. I am going to go out to power plants and coal mines and talk to these folks. I think we are, you're going to hear in this talk about the risks I talk about to the market. I do think that we're not appreciating geopolitical risk to the level that we should, and we are probably not really appreciating the level of what's sustaining production in the U.S. All these drivers that are doing it, and the ability when we start floating up with higher oil prices, are we going to actually hedge and capture those? So a lot of nuances, a lot of uncertainty in the market. I would love to work with you guys, so please reach out. Okay, so with all that being said, we are looking at for this podcast, the body of this podcast that you're going to listen to. When I recorded, when we did this, it was $60 oil, so very close to what it is right now. We talk about Trump going to South Korea, what's going on with China. We get into U.S. shale. What are the drivers for the rising oil production that we're seeing in U.S. shale, from lateral lengths to the rig count? We talk about drill baby drill. We talk about Trump administration policies, and we get into artificial intelligence and power. And we also talk about the government shutdown, geopolitical risk, and the Fed. And then we talk really about what are the risks in the market, right? Jobs, what we're seeing from the oil and gas sector, risks to the industry that we might produce. I think we might actually produce more than the industry is expecting. And so all these things of headwinds and how to think about the market. And then there were some really fantastic questions from the audience. So thank you guys so much for this. Thank you guys so much for listening. That is your roundup. That is your recap. Now, I'm going to end this year on a very high note. The next podcast, episode 147, is going to be the Houston Producers Forum talk that I did with Andrew Navanti, with Calpine, with Ron Gusick, with the CEO of Liberty, and with Sheldon Burleson, with Rockcliffe. So that is a star-studded, awesome panel. That is going to be the next podcast. But with that, folks, thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Amanda Beabout, and I'm one of the audit partners here at Whitley Penn. I'm thrilled to be hosting this fireside chat. Today we have the distinct honor of hosting Trisha Curtis, a globally recognized expert in oil and gas markets and the president and CEO of PetroNerds LLC. Trisha brings a wealth of experience and insight to our conversation. She's a macroeconomist with deep expertise in U.S. shale, geopolitics, and global energy markets. Her work has informed policy and strategy at the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and major industry players. She's presented at forums around the world, including OPEC, Society of Petroleum Engineers, and Oxford University. And she's the voice behind the highly respected PetroNerds podcast. Trisha has a real gift for making complex market dynamics easy to understand and turning them into insights that you can actually use. We're excited to hear her take on what's happening across the energy landscape right now. We want this session to be interactive, so we will be taking questions at the end. You can submit them through the app, or we'll have someone walking around to gather them from you. So let's kick things off with oil prices and the biggest questions of the day. This has been a wild year and a very volatile couple of months for the energy markets. So tell us, what's going on with oil prices?
Yeah, so I'm happy to be here. This is the fourth. This is like the fourth tour for the Whitley Penn conferences, so it's been a blast. So thank you guys for being here. But yeah, a lot going on in the oil market. So probably the biggest question I get from clients and from podcast listeners and from just people in general is, what is happening with the oil space and where are we at for prices? So right now we're at $60 a barrel. Not bad, not amazing. People are not feeling really, really great. We were about $62 the other day, and there's so much happening in the market, and in these AI conversations and in that previous panel, there were a lot of things I wanted to jump up and say, but I held it in. That we don't have a lot of deep understanding of the global market dynamics being priced into oil, or at least like getting back into the market. So people aren't getting up on TV and saying, okay, these are the 5 things that are impacting oil. So $60 a barrel right now. We have Trump is going to meet with Xi Jinping shortly, within the hours. Last night, if you stayed up and watched the news, he gave a speech in South Korea. He talked a lot about energy. He talked about LNG exports. Huge stuff going on the gas side. So big excitement there on natural gas. But the $60 oil, we have averaged actually $67 a barrel up until that moment where we dropped to 57 a couple weeks ago. That drop to $57 a barrel was not because probably because we have a lot of oil in the market, but that's not why it dropped. It dropped because Trump put out a Truth Social post, but he put out a Truth Social post in response to what China had done a couple days prior, which was put on rare earth export restrictions. So China puts these rare earth export restrictions on. People think this is out of left field. Trump responds, as he should have and did, and said, hey, we are going to slap massive tariffs on you if you continue to do this. And then the market went in a tizzy and the stock market drove down. Oil prices went with it. But then on Monday, when the stock market recovered and everybody got all happy, oil did not recover. And that's kind of I say that because that's kind of the story with oil all year, is that there's a million reasons why oil is selling. And there's not a lot of reasons. People don't have this understanding of oil. We haven't lost demand. I just had a Reuters journalist call me on the Uber ride over here, and I was explaining the oil market for an article she's doing. And I was saying, we have so much of this oil on the water. We have the International Energy Agency a couple weeks ago came out with their report and said we have all this oil on the water and we have a lot of oil supply. So we have a lot of oil supply in the water. The Saudis have increased output. We have OPEC plus, and we can get into that. But we have all these fundamentals of, hey, we have a lot of supply. We do, producing 13.64 million barrels per day. But I think we don't have an appreciation that demand has not cratered. It has not fallen off a cliff. And so every time we have a meeting, like Trump has a meeting with Putin when he had in Alaska, that was a reason to sell oil. Peace was going to break out. Gaza and Israel and Hamas, we had a peace deal with them, and that was a reason to sell oil. Although none of these things actually impacted the barrels. And so what drove oil prices back up the other day, just over a week ago, was that reality set in. And that was that, yes, we have oil in the water, but demand has not cratered because we are not in a full out-and-out recession yet, or people haven't fundamentally lost their jobs. And what happened was that we sanctioned Russia. So Rosneft and Lukoil were sanctioned the same day. The European Union put sanctions on Chinese refineries for Russian crude oil, and India said that they want to get the tariffs lowered, so they said we're going to stop taking Russian crude oil. So all of that came together, and then oil prices went back to 62, and they've since come down. So my point with all this is that this entire year you've had traders on the sell button for oil and a bias toward the sell side of oil that has not necessarily reflected fundamentals or reality. And so when you see a $5 swing in oil prices, that is traders, that is not fundamentals. And so I am definitely, people are calling me an oil bull now, and I'm not an oil bull, but right now I am more bullish than the market is. And we, at a minimum, probably should be at $65 a barrel, just given all this massive geopolitical risk, which we'll probably get into.
You just touched a little bit on the impact of geopolitics in industry trends, so we want to dive into that further. Specifically, how do developments that involve Saudi Arabia, which you mentioned, and OPEC Plus factor into that current landscape?
Yeah, so Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus, really when we're talking about OPEC, and that was a lot of the reasons for selling on the sell button is that, April 2nd we had Tariff Day or Liberation Day, and then April 3rd, you had the Saudis come out and OPEC Plus and say they're going to increase output. So that didn't help on oil. But I can tell you before that, if I was talking to the industry and I could take a poll of the industry, the sentiment was bad, right? We were in the high 60s in March, and people were pretty negative about, they were very concerned about the Trump administration talking about $50 oil. So there was very negative sentiment in the industry. There was negative sentiment from traders. But Saudi Arabia, or OPEC Plus, largely led by Saudi Arabia, they have increased output beginning in April. Most of those increases, if you look at the OPEC Plus numbers each month when they keep doing them, most of those increases, about half each time, go to Saudi Arabia. And the whole point is that Saudis were taking back their lollipop cut. So a couple years ago, the Saudis took an additional voluntary 1 million barrels a day off the market, just to help support the market. I really think that was about cohesion. That was really, the whole market gets to feel good. They get to feel that OPEC Plus is very cohesive and they're doing a good job and there's no disagreements, which is a load of hogwash, right? There's a ton of disagreements within OPEC, but the Saudis did this and it really did help support the market. Now the Saudis are looking at the market and saying, what the heck? We have lost a lot of market share, and the Russians are taking a lot of market share from us. Iraq is taking market share, Iran is taking market share, so they want that back. And I've said this honestly, but if the Saudis were paying me and I was advising them, I would have absolutely told them this was probably a decent time to put barrels back on the market. Because the market's not in a horrible place, but at the same time, there's going to be sanctions coming, and that the Russians have eaten your lunch, that Iran has eaten your lunch, and Iraq has, and they're all pushing into China. So if you're the Saudis, you put barrels back on the market. And that's essentially what they've done. And so what this has done is it's accumulated into, we're, like, when you hear about this oil on the water and all this concern, it's really what happened from August to September is everybody exported more barrels, including us. We export almost about 4 million barrels a day of crude oil. And so ours goes up a little bit and it's not sitting on the water. Saudis goes up, it's sitting on the water. Russia's goes up, it's sitting on the water. And so you get all this oil sitting on the water. And so the thing I hear in the market is, oh, we have all this oil on the water and it's record supplies. It's like what we had during COVID. It's not COVID because the oil on ground, the oil here in Texas or in Cushing, Oklahoma, is not at COVID levels. So it's not the same. So yes, there's a lot of oil in the water, but think about, India's taking 2 million barrels a day of Russian crude. China's taking 2 million barrels a day of Russian crude. China takes 2 million barrels a day of Iranian crude. You think about that, if you start sanctioning those barrels, you can sop up and mop that extra supply on the water pretty quickly. So that OPEC Plus and the extra supply has a lot to do with Saudi Arabia and then putting those barrels back on the market and then wanting to take back market share. Now, a lot of people in this room might say, well, is it about U.S. shale and do they want to kill U.S. shale? Well, they've tried before. It has not worked. And I really think, I don't know if they've given up per se. I don't think they fundamentally understand it. I think they really do struggle with it. The industry still has a hard time understanding. I think this industry has a hard time wrapping their arms around producing 13.64 million barrels per day, despite all the negative sentiment and with a lesser rig count and everybody kind of going down. We've since brought those rigs back up and we can talk about that, but I think we're in a very, very unique spot right now.
And we'll come back to the U.S. markets in just a second, but staying globally just for another minute and kind of circling back to, you mentioned China a second ago. You recently wrote about how winning against China means winning on energy. So can you tell everyone a little bit more about what you meant by that and what should the U.S. be doing differently?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big things you're hearing right now is, I mean, obviously Trump is meeting with Xi Jinping. He's in South Korea. He was just in Japan. He just met the new Japanese prime minister, the first female prime minister. And, you know, all this is, you know, all these meetings up to this meeting leading up to Xi is kind of funny because it is all about China, right? All this defense stuff he's doing with Japan, this is all about China. Meeting with South Korea, all these, the shipbuilding he's trying to do with South Korea. All this is about China. It's competing with China. And so, you know, I would say that one of the biggest things, if you're trying to assess risk, and I think we'll probably talk a little more risk toward the end, but if you're thinking about risk in the market, I think that geopolitics is really rising up there. And that's why I really don't think oil prices are appropriately pricing in. They don't even have it. There's barely a geopolitical risk premium in oil prices right now. And we have a massive amount of geopolitical risk out there. And so China's that big one. And so all the stuff that you're hearing, you're going to hear today or probably later, it's tomorrow when Trump meets with Xi, and you know, maybe we sell them, you know, maybe to get the rare earth export restrictions lifted, maybe we say we give them some NVIDIA Blackwell chips. I don't think that's a good move. I don't think we should be giving them NVIDIA Blackwell chips. NVIDIA obviously wants to because they want to make money. They're out for themselves. We shouldn't be giving them those. But the point of all this is that they are a direct head-to-head competitor. Okay, so you're going to hear all this stuff. You're going to hear that it's cooled off, the stock market's up and everything. All the stuff under the surface has not changed. The competition with China has not changed. The Trump administration hasn't, you know, woken up overnight and they were on Air Force One and said, oh my gosh, they're our friends. Let's just go play nice. That's not what's happening. They're doing all the negotiation behind the scenes. They're trying to keep things going and have these negotiations and make sure that there's not a war over Taiwan or there's not something big under their administration, which is essentially what every administration does. But they are fundamentally changing, you know, they're responding to China and saying we are going to compete. And what China's doing, they just had their fourth plenum meeting, and they are basically saying, hey, we're focusing on technology, we're focusing on self-reliance, and we're focusing on resilience. They've been saying this for years, but they actually are doing it. So the whole article I did on this op-ed on winning on energy is that if you look at China's energy, it tells you a great deal about China. They are the largest manufacturing producer, largest manufacturing horsepower in the entire world, and that's backed by energy. You can't refine rare earths, you can't mine rare earths, you can't do anything without energy. China is not a nation rich in oil, but they are a nation rich in coal. And so they are basically full stop backed by coal. And so they have the 21st century's modern coal power, just not dissimilar to Germany in World War II when Germany was a coal power. So China's, they have 10,000 terawatt hours of power generation. That is 1/3 of the world's power generation. And 5,800 of those, over 5,800 of those terawatt hours are coal alone. That is more than any nation on earth has total power. So there's no other nation on earth, including us, that we don't even have 5,800 terawatt hours of power generation. China's got that in coal alone, and then they get a bunch of extra, you know, almost double that on top of that. So it's a really serious thing when we think about, okay, people think about wargaming, and they think about oil, and they think about VLCCs, and you know, we can stop the crude shipments going into China, and then they won't go after Taiwan, and we won't have a war. Wars are fought not just on the oil that you fuel in your planes, they're fought on how you make the damn plane, and you make it with power generation. We see this acutely with Russia and Ukraine. You can actually chart Russian and Ukraine power generation. Very interestingly, Russia's power generation has went up and Ukraine has went down in the past 4 years. And Russia's done a, you know, in terms of war tactics, I'm not saying they're doing a good job, but in terms of the job of, like, you know, you hurt your enemy and you try to wear them down on morale, electricity is a great way to do that. Because Ukraine can't make the drones, they can't keep their lights on, they can't do stuff if they don't have power generation, and that's what Russia's done to them. And you'll notice we're heading into winter, it's getting cold in Ukraine, and they're really hitting their power. They want to make sure they keep it to where these guys cannot heat their homes, and they really break them down. So when it comes down to China, it's really, really serious. The reason they can make all the ships, they can make t-shirts and batteries and wind turbines and solar panels and all this cheap crap that we buy and shove into our grid is because they have a lot of coal-fired power generation. It's very, very cheap. They only charge about 3 cents a kilowatt hour in the province of Xinjiang. That's where they make a lot of the solar panels and wind turbines and batteries. That's where they have a lot of forced labor. But 3 cents a kilowatt hour, that's nothing. And our average prices are about 20 cents a kilowatt hour now in the US on a big growth trajectory. We had flat electricity prices for about a decade, and then they rose beginning in 2020 under the Biden administration. So, and part of this is those policies, but it's also shoving wind and solar into the grid, it's pulling out coal. And so we have to realize that we're in a direct head-to-head competition with China, and it's as basic as energy, and that's not fundamentally being appreciated in the market. So that's the synopsis.
Okay, thank you for that. So now we can bring it back a little bit more locally to the U.S. market. So what have you seen so far this year? I know it's kind of been a roller coaster and ever changing, and even since you did our first conference, there's been a lot of change. But today, what is kind of the biggest thing going on in U.S. shale right now?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, so 2 months ago, we did the first conference in Midland, and actually we're about the same oil prices. I would say some of the biggest things is the sentiment has gotten worse, in the field. I'd say like and you hear this from the Dallas Fed survey and stuff, like sentiment is relatively poor. But I would say that when we talked about natural gas, that is really positive. I think you heard it on the previous panel, on the mineral panel. But really, the natural gas story is, I think there's an incredible confusion on AI and the power demand pull versus LNG. So there's a lot of confusion there. There's a massive amount of excitement around natural gas. And I think that's warranted. I think it's very, very real, is that we should be excited about natural gas and we should be investing in it and banking on it. But in terms of how much is going to go into power for AI and how much is going to LNG, there's a bit of a split right now. And I'm not sure the oil and gas industry has a fundamental understanding of exactly what's going to happen there. I also think we have to be careful is that we are going to get better about using this energy. So as much energy as that we're using for AI and the demand, it's really real. We need to be building out power generation. But the efficiency is going to grow. And so when we saw DeepSeek come out in February of this year, or January or February of this year, we had the DeepSeek moment, everybody freaked out. The reason they freaked out was because DeepSeek came out and they said we did this for $6 million. This is China's chatbot, DeepSeek. They did it for $6 million and they built it in 2 months. Now, that's not true, right? They didn't do it for $6 million. They didn't build it in 2 months. But it spooked the market. And so everybody traded down, like all the utility trades, all the energy trades, all traded down with it. NVIDIA lost more value in a single day than in share price in US history based upon that move. And so that was all backed on, part of that thinking was how much energy we're going to use. So one of the biggest things I think in the shale patch is this optimism on natural gas, and you see that in price. But if you notice, look at Henry Hub prices. We're north of $3 an MCF, which is great. And everybody's super bullish, and that's helping. It's helping offset the sort of pessimism on oil. And then oil, though, so we're looking at the forward curve is in backwardation, so future prices are higher than they are right now, which makes sense because we're too low right now. And for natural gas, they're lower, so they're actually in contango, where the forward price is lower than right now. And that tells you some things that I think I'm a little concerned that people are not going to, take the high prices of natural gas when they should. So when we start seeing high 3s or even close to 4, that's probably a good time to hedge. Don't get greedy. And then in oil, the biggest things are peak shale. This conversation, the panel that you guys had on, where you're talking about refracs. We're not refracking. Let's be honest. We're not refracking in earnest, and that's because completion costs are really expensive. However, completion costs and drilling and completion costs right now, they look pretty damn good. And that's because the operators are beating the crap out of service providers, and so you're getting very, very low completion costs. This is a very good time to lean in. When everybody is leaning out, that is when you lean in. And so when everybody's pessimistic and they're turning away, this is a great time to lean in. And I think you're actually seeing operators do that. Lots of folks are talking about, like, the US is not ceding market share to OPEC. It's a smart move. I don't think the US industry didn't get together and say, let's not cede market share to OPEC. But realistically speaking, that's what's happened. And so when people say, and the other big question I get, and I'll link this back, is people always ask, what about drill baby drill? Like, what does drill baby drill mean? And no, we're not going to drill baby drill. It's $60 oil. Well, the news flash for everyone is you drilled baby drilled, because we have produced a crap ton of oil this year, and we did it at $67 average prices. So the industry did it. And they didn't do it because the Trump administration told them to. They did it because the regulations were right, and because of all these things I've said, is that the prices, came down first for day rates for rigs. And really, when we start compounding all these incredible efficiencies, so we're getting decent prices on the completion side. But on the rig side, we're drilling massively longer laterals, like significantly longer laterals, and we're doing those faster. And so our day rates don't necessarily have to come down because we don't need them. We don't need that rig is long. And so we have these faster drilling times, we have longer laterals, and all these things are compounding together. Even if you don't have to have a massive change month over month or quarter over quarter, you just have to have a small incremental change. And then you think about the tens of thousands of wells that we've drilled and completed in the US, that starts adding up, and so that's why we're seeing a cumulative effect where you eke out a little bit more. And I think that's what's brought us to this 13.64 million barrels per day. So I would say in the shale patch, there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance where we had this negativity, a lot of folks thinking we're going to drop oil production, and it didn't actually happen, at least over the summer. If we continue to see a lowering of the rig count, we will see that, but we've actually seen the rig count come down, and then it's come back up, and we're back over 500 rigs now.
That being said, if you had to make a prediction, continue to go up for 2026?
The production rates or
rig
oil?
count, rig count.
For 2026, if we go to 65, if oil prices do what they should do, which is probably kind of flirt back up, a couple times back towards 70 with geopolitical risk, yes. That is and then if oil companies understand kind of all these things I'm saying is that it's not that bad, this is a good time to kind of lean in. You don't overproduce. But it looks like when you're looking at the rig count and you're, hearing from frac companies, last quarter it was worse, right? People are talking about white space on the calendar. So it doesn't look as bad. And so I think that, yes, I think we're going to start seeing at least this like concept of plateauing seems to be, it's changed. I think in our last Whitley Penn conference, we were talking about this of peak shale and versus plateau. And I think this kind of plateauing concept is that the industry is naturally going into it. I think output will continue to incrementally increase unless you drop that rig count dramatically.
Okay, very good. I did just want to circle back to one other thing you had mentioned. We talk a lot about AI. It's always such an interesting topic. It was a great presentation. You did touch on something that I don't think is always the first thing we think of when we talk about AI, and that is the demand for more power. And I didn't know if you wanted to add anything else to that, just in general on, what does that mean for the infrastructure that we're going to need just as more and more power is going to be in demand to support all of these AI advancements?
Yeah, so you're getting a synopsis in this conversation of a lot of different themes. AI, the first thing I do think about is power, right? That's actually from the business standpoint, from the stock market standpoint, and that's what's really interesting is that I think the oil and gas industry is going to have to send a thank you card to some AI companies because finally you're starting to hear people talk about the need for electricity and the need for energy in a very serious fashion. And so that's why I say the stuff with China is really, really serious, is because AI does not work at all, from the chips to actually powering them, if you do not have energy. We have more energy than any nation in the entire world, and yet we are bickering with each other on how to get the damn power into the grid. Like, China's not, right? They just did it, and they did it with coal. We have more natural gas, more oil, and more coal in the ground than any nation in the world, and yet we can't figure this out because of regulations and because of costs and because we think we're going to decarbonize, we're going to put wind and solar into the grid, and we've raised costs up. So AI is all about power demand. Like, you can only make this efficient if you have the power. So yes, when you're hyperscalers and you build the stack and you try to have power, that's the big problem right now, is that any AI company who's trying to build these LLMs and trying to do something, they need a lot of power to actually power these data centers. Now, the problem is that when they go to the utility companies, a few years ago would have said, okay, give us time, in about 6 months we'll have this for you. And now it's taking a lot longer for that, right? And so now when they put these data centers in and they're pulling on this power, now they're starting to put some real strain on the grid. And so we already had strains on the grid because we didn't have very good grids to begin with. And so the demand, like when we talk about this and we say everybody's pointing to AI, and there's lots of issues with this, but they're pointing to AI and they're pointing to natural gas and they're saying, look, those are the two problems. That's why we have rising electricity prices. We had rising electricity prices well before we had AI. And that is because we were decommissioning coal and we were adding wind and solar. And now in the US grid, we actually have more wind and solar in the grid for power generation than we have coal. So your cheap baseload dispatchable power is moving down, and your intermittent, expensive, and unreliable wind and solar is going up. That's why you have rising electricity costs. Now add in the fact that you're adding AI like crazy, you are really pressuring the grid. And so yes, you're gonna see higher price spikes. This gets complicated because you have a lot of tech companies who want to dance around this issue and say they're decarbonizing and they're doing everything. They say that, but they need that power more than anything. So they're going to make a deal with the devil. They'll sell their soul. They'll do whatever they have to. That's why you have companies doing 3 Mile Island and doing nuclear. And I'm all for nuclear. Like, I think it's a good option. But we have to realize that nuclear is probably a ways out. Like, there's a lot of hesitancy around nuclear. People are fearful of it. They shouldn't necessarily be. But it's not there right now. And so what we have right now is natural gas. And so I think the first thing you should think about when you think AI is power. I mean, when you are typing into ChatGPT, it is using a crap ton of energy. I mean, I always ask it, like, how much are you using, and I try to do the math and everything, but it's a lot, right? And so those are really, really serious fundamental things to think about. And then importantly, it's not just AI, it's manufacturing, right? If you were following the Trump administration, if you're following the stuff, every single, not every single, but most of the executive orders have a tie back to geopolitics and the defense industrial base. And so building ships, building AI, when Jensen Huang, when the CEO of NVIDIA is talking about energy, when he's saying this is great, the US is building out energy, the reason we can do this in the US is because the US is building out energy, like this is really serious. So you can't, it's not just AI though, it's that shipbuilding, it's everything. You have to have the energy to power it. And so China can do this, they can do it so cheaply because they can subsidize it with this coal-fired power generation. So we're gonna be stressing the grid even more when we try to build something. You just think about any plant, any ability to just turn your lights on, you can't build out anything. And so the thing that this administration is trying to do is make it easier to build stuff, right? It's just saying yes to permits, saying yes to permit approval. All that's gonna add, that's re-vitalizing your economy, but it's trying to re-vitalize your defense industrial base and just your industrial manufacturing base, and all that requires power.
All right. So another current thing right now, obviously the government shutdown. I don't think any of us thought it was gonna be going on to week 4. What ripple effect is the government shutdown having into the oil and gas markets?
I don't think there's there's not necessarily a direct effect into the oil and gas market, other than it's one of those many, no one's talking about it, right? We're 4 weeks into this government shutdown and no one's actually paying attention. You got the stock market ripping, and Trump's over he's in Asia right now. It's really interesting, like, that you can have this going. So it's definitely having an impact on the economy. You have people always talking about national parks and things, but it's been a pretty unique government shutdown, right? Where they've done some continuing resolutions, they've kept certain things open. Now we're starting to hear about air traffic control and some issues there, but they've you hear about them not paying the military, but they seem to be paying the military. So there's a lot of confusion there. I listen to Bloomberg Surveillance a lot, and they do some decent political analysis in the morning. And so it is interesting that the bet that both sides are making, both Democrats and Republicans, and I'm not trying to be partisan here, is that they're both making the bet that the voter will blame the other party. It seems to be working out a little better for the Republicans, I think, than they thought, because what you're hearing is Hakeem Jeffries, and you're hearing Mandami, and you're hearing these very, very far left folks basically say, we're not gonna do anything. Well, that you're increasingly hearing from the analysts is that this is being led by a very far left socialist group that wants a lot of government spending. And so we're in this roadblock where the average person, if they have a job, if they're running, if they're doing stuff, they're not being heavily impacted. But it is really serious is that we're 4 weeks in. And so when you start adding up risk in the market, it's, people, they were sort of, over the course of this year, CEOs were sort of bucketing different levels of risk, and you have geopolitical risk, you have trade and tariffs, and then you have, there's all kinds of different risk. Geopolitical risk is kind of need to rising to the forefront, and it's interesting for CEOs outside of oil and gas, geopolitical risk is number 1, and it's not in oil and gas. And so I would just add in this government shutdown as being another layer of this. And then right now we have the Fed probably, I suppose they already did it, they probably lowered interest rates a quarter basis point, probably in the past hour. We have an economy that's at 3% GDP. We have unemployment where we don't have the unemployment data, so that's probably one of the biggest ones, is that we don't have this data. And so if we don't have data, it's hard to make decisions, but yet everyone's still going. So I think it adds this layer of cloudiness and this opaqueness that's not good. I think that it's kind of like where we know the U.S. oil and gas market really well. We don't know the Chinese market at all, and then we end up focusing on the U.S. and making trades and bets on that. And so when we don't have this for the U.S., it just makes confusion. I don't think the world's going to end. Oh, look, we have light. Oh, look. That's probably because of wind and solar.
It is spooky season.
That was a joke, guys. Yeah.
So you touched quite a bit on different risks. So we have geopolitical risk, we have tariffs, we have trade, we have AI, we have job loss. What's the risk we haven't talked about? What's the other risk out there that should be more top of mind?
So I think there's two things that are thinking about. Like I do think that headlines right now. I mean, GM just laid off people. I mean, basically every day you're hearing of layoffs, like another round of layoffs, right? Another company, Amazon, Microsoft, GM, like starting to hear more and more layoffs, right? Now, when you take a poll and you talk to your friends, if people have a job, that's what matters in the economy, right? Is if people have jobs, they continue to spend. We do have a pretty bifurcated economy where the high end is spending. People who have money are spending their money. People who do not have money are living paycheck to paycheck. But as long as the music is still playing and we're playing musical chairs, it's when the music stops that's the problem, right? Everything works. And that's why I say oil demand is really important to think about that, is that I feel like in the oil and gas community we have kind of a cognitive dissonance in this, and a lot of groupthink, so I think there's a big risk there, is that we sort of think that oil prices are low and it's gonna be bad, or now this kind of pulling in and saying it's gonna be low, but that's gonna mean we're gonna have higher in the future and then it's gonna be great. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think you might be muddling in this period for a while, oil prices should be higher, but that does not mean that you're gonna go higher and stay up there, because every time we do that, we get more oil out of the ground, and we have a lot of oil. Like, the one thing you can take to the bank is the rock will give it to you, and it will give it to you, you'll get more at a higher price point. But we are getting better and better, and we don't appreciate this as an industry, that when we get stuck at a lower price point, and Chris Wright talked about this earlier this year, and it was interesting, I didn't hear a lot of people comment on this, is that he said, you know, the industry is gonna get better, it's not gonna be fun necessarily, but the industry is gonna get better at doing it lower. And the industry does it every time. It doesn't feel good, and we've had inflation. So I think that there's a risk that we can, in the industry, that we will produce more than we think. I think that's real, and it happens all the time. I think globally and geopolitically, this China and geopolitical risk, I think that we don't do a good job in business thinking about this long-term stuff that you say, oh, it's out there, right? AI, all these stuff, it's out there. I don't have to worry about it now. Yeah, you do though. Like if you're a CEO, and I work with a lot of executive C-suites, you do have to think about this. Now you don't have to, freak out like I do. Sometimes when I go to bed at night and like worry about all these things, but you have to put it into your risk profile and purview of how you're allocating money in investment decisions. And increasingly, like you could have done this with Russia. Like if you were exposed in any value chain to Russia beginning in 2014, you had several years. You had 2014 when they took Crimea till 2022 to get out. If you didn't, you're an idiot. And no offense, but seriously, like it's not like you didn't know that they were doing bad things. You've got this with China. If you have exposure to China, you're being told right now, get out. Look at Starbucks, they're selling, right? They're gonna make $4 billion, which is awesome for them. But that's the signal to the market. And so we have this risk that I think a lot of people think it's gonna be okay, we can just kick the can down the road. And so it's this long-term thinking of how does this impact, and I think there's ways you can translate this into how you do business. And things with China are also like, they have 18 million barrels a day of refining capacity. They now have as much refining capacity as we do. And so I think it's things like that concern me, that the market has no appreciation for the fact that the things that they do on rare earths, where they can, refine and then dump, and drop the prices and prevent people from getting to the market, they could potentially do that on oil. Now, I don't think that's their game plan, what they actually intend to do. They want to stockpile and they want to have the refining capacity just to secure themselves. But the impact is that, the reality is that it could have an impact on the market. And so there's just a lot of things on the geopolitical risk profile that I don't think being translated into business. And I think we need to do a better job of that. So that's the big stuff. And then unemployment, like creeping up, and economic crises. We talked about this, everybody's talking about this AI bubble. It is bubblicious, right? Like, oh my gosh, look at the stock market, it's absolutely ridiculous. And the one thing when I hear this AI panel, and I heard at the previous conference, my takeaway is that there's no way it's gonna look the same as it does now, right? 5 years from now, it's not gonna look the same. It is gonna penetrate, it's gonna be very, very real, but it's not gonna look the same. And increasingly, I think, if I was just to guess right now, I would say that proprietary AI models internally are gonna be the game. Because you don't want all your information, if you're Exxon, and you've got a crap ton of big data, we've been talking about big data for years, you don't want that getting out, you want that internally, but you definitely wanna learn from that. You hear the military talking about this. I mean, you think of all the intelligence that if you could pull into an LLM every battle that we've ever done, and then and learn from that, and have your people learn from that. You could really level up their knowledge quickly, but you can also see how there's huge risks with that. So there's a lot of serious implications, and I do think the risk thing, people were talking about that like a year or so ago. Elon Musk and others were talking about the big scare factors, and now we're not talking about the scary stuff anymore. We just have Jensen Huang around telling us that we can't be China hawks, and that's bad. I'm absolutely a China hawk, and he's completely wrong. Is okay to be a China hawk. But we have to be very careful with that. And then lastly, I would say letting business dictate policy. And that's what I'm very, very concerned about with folks like Jensen Huang, is that, and I don't think that's necessarily what the Trump administration is doing, but that is what we've done for 40 years with China, and we can't afford to do that anymore.
You cited a few different sources, articles that you really enjoy outside of the PetroNerds podcast. Obviously, fantastic. Go take a listen. What is your favorite podcast to listen to?
That's a good question. So I listen to a bunch of, I don't want to say amateur, that's probably not a good way to describe them, a bunch of different China podcasts. I actually listen to, it's painful, Beijing Hour. It's like, I listen to a lot of China media podcasts, largely just because I want to know their take, it's kind of painful to get through. I listen to China Talk, which is really good. I listen to a lot of military, a few decent military podcasts, Irregular Warfare, and I would say Bloomberg Surveillance is like the recap in the morning when I am staying up too late and I don't get up at the crack dawn. I got to see it this morning. Bloomberg Surveillance is really good, and then I would say really it's the like, I live, eat, and breathe this, and this is why I tell C-suites and CEOs and folks that I talk to, is that you guys are running a business, right? I live, eat, and breathe this, so I have the capacity to take all this and then disseminate it back to you and help you think about it. And it's increasing, like when I'm watching the market or I'm following, Institute for Study of War, and I'm watching what's going on, with the stuff that's going on with Russia and Ukraine, and I'm following the stock market, and I'm doing all this deep diving, and I'm doing books, and I'm looking back at World War II. You're able to pull this all and think about it in a different way, and it really does, like, I'm super blessed. I'm a little overwhelmed with all of it, but I'm super blessed that I have to do this for a living, and it makes me think about things in a different way. So I would say it's that often it's that, when I get a text message from somebody or a client and they say, what about this? And I said, well, that was, if you were watching the stock market at 1 o'clock in the morning, which you probably weren't, this is what happened with Asia, and so So I would say late night stock market watching, the 10 p.m. Middle East Open, that's huge. I love watching that. Because that's like where all your oil stuff is, and who the crappy analysts are, who the good ones are, and what's going on. And I always know when somebody's like fear trading and it's $57 oil, and then you hear the guy get up on TV and he's like, oh, this is great, sell, 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 and you know why, right? They're pumping their own game and everything. So yeah, I would say it's stock market, a few different podcasts, but I'm happy to tell you guys more sources, a lot of different information.
All right, thank you. I do want to make sure we allow plenty of time for questions, so yes. I can walk it, I'm not sure.
Hi, this is great, really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
You had touched earlier on nuclear energy, and you said we're a ways away. What will it take to get there? What does the future look like for that, in your opinion?
No, it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it, because it helps to dive into a little bit more. So nuclear is, I'd say like I'm pro-American energy. So I'm for oil, coal, natural gas, and absolutely for nuclear. And the problem with nuclear is that the fear around it, the misunderstanding around it, and the investment, right? You have to, something that I think if we could take what we've done in LNG, right? I mean, and this is something Trump said last night. He said, hey, there were people that were waiting 15 years for a permit, and when I came in, I approved it in a single day. So if we could do a little bit of that with nuclear, that would help, right? So expedite some of this permitting. But the problem is that every time we've done it, the costs are like, 20x what we predicted. So costs are a big factor. So I think, and I've had Doug Sandridge, there's a bunch of folks that are really good on nuclear right now, and I had him on the podcast and we were talking about this, and I was thinking, okay, if you do it on existing, like where we have the nuclear power right now, and we take where we actually have it, and then we expand from there. That's sort of what we did with what we've done in the refining space in the US, right? Where we just kind of expanded, and we needed to probably expand more, but really the regulations were so onerous on refining and the environmental regulations that basically the existing refiners essentially expanded because it was so hard and the capital costs were so much. And so on nuclear, that's probably where it's gonna go. but everyone's talking about small modular nuclear reactors. And that's what you hear. I just don't know where the cost or I'm not quite sure how that's any different than a big one. A small one is a small one, but it's not like, this isn't a shale well, a $10 million shale well versus a $2 billion project in the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America. It's not the same thing, right? A small modular nuclear reactor carries all the risk and the fear that people have with nuclear, just on a smaller size. And I'm not sure the costs are that much lower, right? So it helps from a mobility standpoint. So I think you need regulations. I think you need somebody to actually do it and get it in cost. The reality is that, as a nation, from a national security standpoint in the military, we do a very good job with it. Like, we've been using nuclear for a long time, and it powers a lot. But, look what Russia has just been talking about, like they're literally just playing more around with their Poseidon and what they've been doing on the nuclear side. And so Russia's had this one card that they played for decades, which is, we are a nuclear power. And whenever they, don't have any cards to play, they just bring that up again, and people take notice. So I always hear from people who are super excited about nuclear, which is awesome, and on the power side, I think they forget that outside of the US, it is used and I'm not saying other countries, but Middle East, China, Russia, it's used in nefarious ways. And yes, it can cross-pollinate. When Saudi Arabia wanted nuclear from us during the Biden administration, they didn't want it just for power, right? They said they wanted it just for power, but they didn't want it just for power. So I'm a little concerned about that. So I think it's great. I think it can work, but we have to have some serious regulatory steps, similar to like saying we can mine for coal in the US. We need to say we need to build a plant. We probably need to have the government support behind it. We need to see how fast and how low we can get the costs and just sort of test this. Once you get one done and you get in there, we might be able to do it. And I think artificial intelligence, the demand from the tech community, it's so high that it might help propel that. But I think it's a little further out there. So if people are thinking, okay, what's the risk on that gas? I don't think it's immediate. All right, guys, you gotta have some curveballs. Yep.
Maybe able to just yell.
What are your thoughts on what's happening in Venezuela right now? And if there is a regime change, whether U.S. assisted or not, what impact could that have to U.S. oil and gas industry?
So you probably heard Venezuela and all the sort of ships being attacked, and we have an aircraft carrier down there. I mean, there's a lot going on. Kind of under the radar. Not under the radar, it's being talked about a little bit, but in the Pacific, right, and in South America. So firstly, I would say, I know I'm going to bring it back to China. It is about China, to a degree. I think a lot of stuff in Latin America right now has to do with, and this is where I think, it's not 5D chess. I'm not going to give the Trump administration more credit than they deserve, but they deserve some credit with this. They're basically saying, hey, I'm going to go meet with Xi Jinping, but I'm going to do all this other crap and push back hard. And the thing in Latin America, it's about drugs, maybe. I think it's a little bit more about China, and it's about showing force, and we haven't heard pushback from the UN. I don't hear anyone going crazy. So I think this is, there's definitely some issues with like regime change, but China's had an inordinate amount of influence. So any developing countries, they've had a massive amount of influence over the past 10, 20, 30 years. And so in Latin America, that's obviously on our back doorstep. I don't think it's a Cuban Missile Crisis moment, but I think there are probably enough red flags that popped up when they came into office thinking, crap, we better address some of these. And we heard more of these coming from Russia and China. So this is a pushback to say we can show force, and we're gonna say it's about drugs. And to a great degree, it probably is a lot about drugs, and you gotta push back on these cartels. And we've had so much coming in into the U.S. So I think that's actually what's happening. I do think the implications for, again, how is that not being impacted on geopolitical risk premium for oil? I mean, we have none. When we're talking about Russian sanctions, when we're talking about India not taking Russian crude, when we're talking about Venezuela, when we're talking about more Latin America, this starts adding up really collectively to where we could get offsides quickly on oil. And I'm not saying we don't have to sop up all that oil in the water, that glut we supposedly have, but these are is a serious issue.
Is it on? Okay. So my question's on Africa, right? So with LNG exports being a big thing here in the U.S., with Europe being the main buyer of them, you know, we had Anadarko discover a huge reserve in Mozambique that was then bought by Oxy, that was then sold to Total, that has now been put on hold. What do you think the timing on reserves like that, you know, mainly that's offshore, coming online, and how would that impact the global oil market?
That's a really good question in terms of just thinking about the, you know, global supply. And I think something you are hearing out of OPEC, they always say this, but they say, you know, if we don't start investing, we're going to be short. I'm hearing this more from big notable CEOs as well, you know, big major companies in the US starting to say this as well, we're underinvesting. I think we have to be a little bit careful about it as well. Every time we say that, we end up not over-investing, but we end up having more oil. All that being said, that Africa's hard. You know, like as much as I love, you know, stuff around the world and stuff, it's harder than people think. I mean, you look at Exxon's investments over decades. You know, they had a period where they just invested everywhere in the world, and they lost so much on those because they never proved up. So it's always the above ground stuff, not the below ground stuff. So I'm optimistic on that. I'm not concerned that they don't have it. But in terms of, you know, how quickly it will be brought on and can they do it, usually somebody realizes they have money and then a bunch of people want to come after that money, and that's usually the problem. But in terms of a supply standpoint, and people are now starting to talk more and more about this LNG glut, right? Of we're going to have too much LNG. I'm not convinced of that. So, you know, globally, just to put this in perspective, the natural gas global market is 400 billion cubic feet per day, supply and demand. So like you think roughly oil is about 100 million barrels a day, supply and demand. It's like 104. Natural gas is 400. So when we export around 15, 16 BCF a day, Australia exports around 15, 16 BCF a day, and Qatar exports around 15, 16 BCF a day. That's basically all of it, right? So everything else is piped because you have to transport this, you have to compress it, you have to turn it into a liquid, you have to turn it back into a gas, you have to do all that. So when we think LNG, you know, the demand is real because all these countries need power, right? Latin America, South or Africa, you know, Asia, everybody needs power, so they need the gas. But we haven't had the translation mechanism to like, hey, here's the gas, you can take it. So I say that LNG is still a very new and nascent market, and so I think all this rhetoric now, right, is a lot of misunderstanding of that it's not oil, right? It's not nearly as fungible as just moving the crude oil around on the water. You can put oil in a tanker, you can truck it, you can barge it. You can't do that with gas. And that's why I say it's the same thing to think about with coal, is that I love natural gas, absolutely love it. It's great energy dense fuel, but you have to actually put it in a pipeline. And so we, year over year, did not grow LNG exports from 2023 to 2024 globally. So that is partly because the market didn't have it, but we don't have enough ships to actually move the stuff around. So I am not concerned about the market absorbing it. I'm concerned about us in the past several years. Everyone, global leaders have focused so much on decarbonization that they haven't incentivized, you know, told countries, hey, we have LNG, you can consume it, here's how to do it. Because you have to build your economies around this, and you can't say, I'm going to decarbonize, I'm not going to decarbonize, I don't know what I'm doing. You have to let these countries actually build a grid based on this. So there's a lot of stuff that has to go behind the scenes. So good policy, good leadership, and helping these countries develop the infrastructure so they can actually take this, and then having rule of law policies to where they know they can get it, having the market available. That's why I say having a new and nascent market, and LNG still is, you have to have all that stuff that they can have certainty. And certainly in Asia, when the Biden administration put a pause on LNG exports in January 2024, they lost all their certainty, and they started talking about nuclear, and they started talking about coal, because they didn't know if they could get LNG from the US. So all these places, it just has to grow. And so I would say that the market's there, I'm optimistic about it, but I'm always concerned about above ground risk in Africa. Yeah? Yeah.
So, do you expect the US to like, take back the edge on energy from China? Because you were talking about like Starbucks pulling out, I guess, foreign like companies are getting like nervous around the Chinese market. So do you see like those internal crises that are like bubbling under the surface to eventually allow us to take back the edge? And do you think how many years will it take for us to take back, if that's possible?
That's a really good question. I think that we can't underestimate, you know, the nimbleness of the U.S. because we do have this flexibility. So if we were to get our house in order, if we were to appreciate, you know, really these threats, I think would get it. and we could respond pretty quickly. And I say that on energy is we have more oil, more natural gas in production now than any nation. We produce double that of Russia for natural gas, and they are the second largest producer. So we could solve it if we would just deregulate, right? Natural gas prices in the US, that $3 an MCF, the negative Waha that you get in the Permian, the consumer does not get that, right? That's not what it costs to turn these lights on. It costs about, on average, $18 an MCF for the residential consumer. So if we could fix things like that, if we could lower the price for the consumer, that would be huge, right? That's a big win. You could start incentivizing industry. But directly, like in head-to-head competition with China, you have to realize that, I think they are decoupling, right? They are saying we want self-reliance, we want resilience, we want you to be dependent on us, but we don't want to be dependent on you. And they're actively working on doing that. And they've done a pretty good job because everyone in Europe is just oblivious to this massive threat. They know it's there, but they just want to duck and cover and pretend, just like they did with Russia, that it wasn't going to be a problem. And so they end up in this massive bind. So we could fix it. I think that it's going to be painful, and I think that you've started to see the recognition that somebody explained to me, the Trump administration as like a house builder, because he's a real estate guy, and that a lot of people when they buy a house, they like to they buy a house and then they paint it and they change some things and they fix it up a little bit. Trump is he's ripping down the house to the studs and he's rebuilding it from the top, and that is what they are doing with trade. Seriously, so we never had tariffs. We had very, very low tariffs, 1 to 3%. And now we have tariffs just like every other country in the world. And so it's changing the game on trade. And that is a willingness to take some pain. And that's something that, you see with China, they're willing to have pain to have what they want. And so he's at least starting, there's a starting point with the US that we're willing to say we're gonna do this. And super interesting, I think it's fascinating that no one's talked about this, but we haven't seen as much pass-through on tariffs as people thought into inflation. I am super concerned about inflation. I do not think the Fed should be lowering interest rates, and I do disagree with the Trump administration on that front. However, we have not seen the pass-through because a lot of the corporations have eaten some of the costs, and our revenue to the U.S. government is massively up. So in terms of are we making revenue, are we lowering the deficit, tariffs seem to sort of be working. And we're not seeing nearly the pushback. So it's very doable. We have to get serious and we have to be honest with ourselves and have kind of realistic conversations. And I think with businesses, I would like to be talking to more business leaders about long-term threats and realities and talking about China. And that has yet to take place in earnest.
I think we have time for one more question.
This has been great, thank you. So given the deep expertise that you have in U.S. shale, production dynamics, micro politics, I'm just curious, what do you think is maybe the single biggest risk that upstream producers have over the next 3 to 5 years outside of just price volatility or commodity volatility?
That's great, that is a good question, and thank you. So price volatility is one of them. I think I always say it's understanding where prices are at now. I'm not going to tell you, I don't tell my clients where prices are going to be 6 months from now. Although I will prognosticate, and I'm pretty comfortable there. But if you don't understand where you're at, and actually, I don't think early on when we came out of COVID, the big boys, the Exxons, the Chevrons, they did not put the drill bit back in the ground. That was some of the cheapest drilling completion costs we've ever had, and they missed out on that. So that was a big risk, right? That they lost out on. Now they're keeping things very steady. They're not dropping. They're just keeping things steady. They're willing to because when you drop and you raise, you lose that money. So I think one of the biggest risks is not understanding where we're at with prices and not hedging when you could. So if we flirt back up to 70, if you have these opportunities and you don't, especially if you're a smaller or mid-sized company, those are huge opportunities. So I think there's risk there. And then the groupthink really does concern me, right? This cognitive dissonance, thinking about refracs, thinking that, I don't think we have drilled up the Eagle Ford. I'm sorry, I don't think we have drilled up the Bakken. But this thinking permeates through private equity, it permeates through actual investment. It permeates through all the CEOs. So you have to understand where we're at all the way from the top, from the geopolitics all the way to the rock. And I am very bullish on the rock. And so I think that we risk simplifying and misunderstanding and missing out on a lot of money, on billing to raise money. There is trillions of dollars sloshing around. We have the stock market all-time highs. More of that money should be in oil and gas. And so I feel like we've missed out massively on telling the story about energy and telling the story well and collective and getting that. So I think the risk is missing out on this, like getting the good. And I do think misreading the market for AI. Like I heard this very bullish like nat gas thesis about a year ago, right? And then it really built onto this AI craze. But you know, EIA, and I'm not saying they're right, their price spike in natural gas that they're projecting for next year is driven on LNG exports. It's not driven on power demand. And that's because on the power side, they're showing a bunch of wind and solar. So the other big risk is that the oil and gas and upstream space is not deeply understanding electricity, not understanding their role in electricity, natural gas, and not advocating for it. I mean, Pioneer Natural Resources and every company when I lived in DC, they were lobbying for crude oil exports. And then we got crude oil exports, and now we export 4 million barrels a day of crude oil. We wouldn't have the shale patch we have today without those crude oil exports. But we are not, the oil and gas industry is not lobbying or understanding the same implication for power, where more natural gas needs to go into electricity generation, wind and solar needs to stop, and the pass-through, the savings need to be passed on to the consumer so that we can all benefit, right? And so I think electricity is the other massive risk, is that, you know, the fact that we're going to the fact that we're having to do behind the grid, behind the meter stuff, and all this AI, all this power solutions is because utilities are not keeping up. And so I think oil and gas, especially in states where I live in Colorado, they have not been honest. They have not talked out and got on the mic and said, hey, this is crap. The regulatory environment here is horrible. This is completely biased, and we need to vote these people out of office. And I wish we had more of that. So I think there's lots of policy risk.
All right. Well, that is all we have time for today. Trisha, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come and teach us all about geopolitics and impact on energy.
Thanks, guys.